This is Brian Kemple of Continuum Philosophical Insight, and this is the second installment in a brief series on a paper that I wrote some time ago, earlier this year, and delivered at Aquinas College in Grand Rapids, Michigan, on artificial intelligence and concept formation. And in the first installment, I proceeded through a discussion of the general notion of intelligence, and specifically focused upon animal intelligence, in an effort to try and get a little bit at what we really mean by the term intelligence. And a large part of the reason that I'm doing this is to question whether or not artificial intelligence, as that phrase is conventionally used, is really used in a fully meaningful sense. Now, I'll be honest and tell you right out that here I'm trying to rush through this a little bit. In the sense that I haven't done a whole lot of going back and looking carefully at the paper before I started this recording. I'm kind of just proceeding through a little willy-nilly, and we're going to see where it takes us. So I'm picking back up again here at section 2 of the paper on human intelligence. And here I'm taking up from a point which I had made towards the end of the last video, that there's been this tendency in history to sort of allied, at least in the last several hundred years, allied animal intelligence and human intelligence together, as though they are not specifically different in kind, but are differing only in a matter of degree. So, picking this up, I'm going to read a bit here and say that it is a common misunderstanding, going back at least to the time of Thomas Hobbes, who lived from 1588 to 1679, and certainly to the time of David Hume, who lived from 1711 to 1776. It's a common misunderstanding that human intelligence is of precisely the same kind and orientation as found in non-human animals, that we humans are likewise seeking nothing but the fulfillment of our desires in a context of referential meaning, a concept which I explained a little bit in the last video. Only that we're differentiated from other animals by vastly overcomplicating the objects of our desires, and therefore we create new and more difficult obstacles for ourselves in our pursuit or attainment of these desires as they arise in a context of referential meaning. Now, this misunderstanding was bolstered by the development and acceptance of evolutionary theory, the idea being that all animals are fundamentally genetically determined by desires for basic necessities, but that the more complex the animal's psychological capacities, the more complex the desires developed through experience. In other words, that we all really want the same thing, all animals, but the more that we develop, the more complex the manifestation of this desire becomes. As we sort of are able to have more and more nuanced and deep experiences, the more complex those fundamental desires start to appear. Human beings, from this perspective, are distinguished from other animals by this really common misunderstanding only by what we would call an increased degree of psychological complexity. Thus, our development of religions, theories of a spiritual soul, the afterlife, the divine, and so on, are explained away as desires consequent to some self-aggrandizing psychological complex. That, in other words, feeling ourselves very important, we cannot but make up stories to explain this self-importance, and therefore we fabricate new desires. Desires for everlasting life, for infinite reward, or for some architectonic principle that explains life, the universe, and everything. This misunderstanding, this fundamental misunderstanding which sees human intelligence as precisely of the same kind as animal intelligence, this misunderstanding not only puts the cart before the horse, but actually puts the horse inside the cart, locks the cart up, and shoves the whole thing off the cliff. for it makes our species specifically human intelligence, which is to say the very defining factor of our humanity, as what specifies our biological species, into nothing more than the result of a highly evolved and intricately complicated acquisitiveness, or perhaps even some kind of cosmic avarice. That is, a desire for the universe, all the universe, to be about us and for us. And in short, it makes us into very clever, but very selfish and somewhat hairless apes, and denies that we are fundamentally, or essentially, anything more than that. Instead, to understand our humanity, I believe that we ought to look for a difference similar to that found between plants and animals, a difference outlined in the first video. That is, a difference distinguished by a faculty which enables different operations. That is, faculties being these capacities that we have as living beings to act in a certain way, and operations being understood generally here as the complex series of actions which follow upon the enaction of some faculty. Now, the most immediate and obvious consequences of this species-specifically human faculty, which I will describe momentarily, are so ubiquitously ingrained in the day-to-day operations of our lives that, left to our own devices and our own habits, we might never notice them at all if someone did not point them out to us. What I mean is that, unlike non-human animals, our attentions are bent not merely towards discerning the significance of objects in a context of referential meaning for the sake of solving problems in the attainment of our desires, but rather we spend a lot of time and effort in discerning the significance of the reality of those objects. In other words, their intelligible meaning independent of their referential context, or what they mean in themselves, and not merely what they mean for us in terms of desires and obstacles. Now, this ubiquitous ingrainment of our species-specifically distinctive human faculty, this capacity for discerning the reality of things, or their intelligible meaning independent of the context of reference, this is most obvious, I suppose, in our use of language, and the way in which we go about naming things, and in naming things, try not simply to set up a code for ourselves to refer to them, but for trying to articulate somehow or another what those things are. Now, this faculty of linguistic, enabling, whatever we might call it, we will call it something in a moment, but this faculty, really, it structures everything that we do. How often do we engage in anything, day to day, within our day, from hour to hour, without involving language in those operations? Maybe it's to ourselves alone, maybe we're not speaking out loud, and maybe it's even sort of a muted conversation, or dialogue, or monologue that we are engaged in. But even in the most physical of activities, aside from perhaps playing a sport or an instrument or engaging in physical intimacy, we are actively thinking. And even outside of those particular activities, we understand them, and we quite frequently improve ourselves and our performance in them through thinking about them in a linguistic fashion. Think about the way in which sports teams prepare for games. They talk an awful lot about what the other team does, about what their strategy is, about how things should be executed. They put it in this intelligible framework where it's not simply about reacting to your environment, but being prepared in order to react in the appropriate and most fitting way. But this faculty, which enables this meaning-elevating grasp, this grasp of intelligibilities, is what we conventionally have called the intellect. The operation of the intellect whereby we discover intelligible meanings is one which pervades our entire lives. In other words, consciously or not, we are doing it, or trying to do it, pretty much all the time, trying to discover intelligible meaning. That so often we do it unconsciously, I think leads to a lot of presuppositions about the meanings of things, including, for instance, intelligence. And that is, I think, quite a problem for us, as both individuals and within our society at large. That is to say that just as the perceptual faculties result in percepts, through which we evaluate the referential meanings of our objects, so too, through the intellect, we form concepts, through which we judge the intelligible meaning of the objects that we encounter, both in the world and as certain products of our own thinking. And there's a lot more that could be elaborated on about this, and about the difference between objects we encounter in the world and objects which are the products of our own thinking. I've dealt with this at great length in other places, including my latest academic publication on the intersection of semiotics and phenomenology. In other words, the question of what we might call socially constituted realities, and even sort of fictitious objects, right, which aren't really realities, but have a kind of connection to reality in some way or another. And I won't go into this much further. There's a couple of footnotes which attend to this point in the paper, but it gets a little bit linguistically complicated. So if you're interested, the paper is online, on I believe on my website, and perhaps on academia.edu, and maybe even some other places. I'm not sure, but you can also always just put a comment in the comment section, or send me an email if you would like to read it. But moving along, getting back to this notion of concepts, just as carelessly formed percepts, as we saw in the previous video, can lead us to eat food that makes us sick, so too uncritically formed concepts can lead us to believe things which are not true. Among the most common causes undermining a critical formation of our concepts is an inattentiveness to the percepts upon which they depend. That is, since we do not intellect the intelligible directly, but rather discover it through the objects which are perceived, a failure to attend to our perceptual frameworks and faculties will result inevitably in some skewing or another of our intellectual judgments. That said, even uncritically formed concepts are a kind of marvel within the world of animals. As faculties of intelligence go, this faculty is sui generis. There is literally no other like it in the animal world. It differs from that held by other animals not merely in degree, but also in kind. For there is a radical difference between referential and intelligible meanings. To save the horse from its unceremonious death, that is, to take it out of the cart and put it back in front, it is this capacity to discover intelligible meaning which arouses in us the aforementioned desires for transcendent meaning, for answers to life, the universe, and everything. Put otherwise, we do not invent the questions to fulfill the desires, but we desire the answers because we have discovered the questions. Now, by this, I am trying to elucidate a difficulty which I think many have misunderstood in some way or another over the past several millennia. That sounds perhaps a little brash of me, but I think I have something which is true here. Namely, that we do in fact discover questions. That questions are something that pertains particularly to the human intellect and to the human intellect in its seeking of intelligible meaning. That is, other animals might have curiosity. They might wonder in a related way about the practical referential contexts of the things that they encounter in their lives. But I think questioning specifically is always targeted somehow or another at meaning. This is to differentiate it a bit perhaps from problematizing, in which we set up something as a challenge to be overcome, or a difficulty to be solved in some way, I guess, a problem to be solved, I should say. And what we're looking at here, right, was this discovery of questions, is in recognizing something about the reality of the human existence. That we have desires for transcendent meaning, answers to life, the universe, and everything, is not because we have overcomplicated the situation somehow. It's not because we have sort of overblown our own importance, but rather because we've recognized something about ourselves and something about our ability to think, our ability to understand what things are, and in understanding what things are, we are capable, furthermore, of trying to figure out why. When we grasp even just the vaguest understanding of some object, in terms of its intelligible meaning, that draws us in, right, to questioning further. Well, why is it this way? If we look at something like, say, human beings as mortal, there's a certain sense, I think, in which the mortality of human beings is already immediately, once recognized, distinguished from the mortality of other animals. We don't tend to question so much why other animals have to die, except perhaps, in the sad sense of it being a pet or something like that. But we do immediately question why we have to die. And I think this questioning is not just because we're afraid of death, not just because we see deaths that are perhaps painful or frightening in some way, but because there's something about ourselves which innately desires a continued existence, and a continued existence not just in order to attain further goals, but because we recognize something good about our existence itself. And moreover, that there's something incongruous about our mode of existence, about the way in which we exist, specifically our sort of already present awareness of something timeless in our lives, intelligible meanings, that is. This capacity that we have for that seems incongruous with mortality. There's something about our mortality which isn't entirely fitting to the kinds of things that we are. On the other hand, it is, because we have bodies, and having bodies, we are material, and being material, we are subject to destruction. But all of this, this bit of a tangent here, is trying to point out that it's not self-aggrandizement, but rather self-recognition, which drives this questioning after transcendent meaning, answers to life, the universe, and everything. So I think this brings us to the question of the hour, so to speak. The question of what kind of intelligence can the artificial possess? That is, can computers, robots, algorithms, whatever particular artifice of intelligence processing we might happen someday to produce, can these attain the kind of intelligence we see in animals, or that which we find in ourselves? Can the robots be taught to solve problems in contexts of referential meaning? Can they discover intelligible meanings that are independent of the references with which they have been programmed? I think many AI enthusiasts and AI alarmists alike, as I will call them, would answer yes, and holds both of them in common. Moreover, that robots have already attained these levels of intelligence. They have only yet to develop intelligence to the same degrees as found in animals and in humans. Although with regards to some functions, they clearly already outpace both us and our non-human friends. Now, there's certain questions, right, about the kind of architecture of the computers which is necessary for sort of intelligence processing at the levels of human beings, especially with regards to artificial general intelligence, as it is called today. That is the kind of intelligence at least roughly equivalent to human intelligence. But, that's a bit of a digression here. Nevertheless, despite this confidence, I myself am skeptical of the depth of understanding about intelligence that AI enthusiasts and alarmists alike possess, not when it comes to the artificial, but when it comes to the natural. For one, both non-human and human-animal intelligences involve not only our cognitive grasp of meaning, but also our cathectic responses. Here, I may have mentioned this previously, I don't recall. By the term cathectic, I am not using it in a strictly Freudian sense. I'm using it in a broader sense of simply referring to our capacities for feelings and for emotions. Feelings being understood as the responses that we have to perceptual understanding, and emotions the responses to intellectual or conceptual understanding. That is to say that we cognitively grasp, we cathectically respond, we cognitively interpret, and that these three steps go on in an indefinitely recurring cycle. Our cognition is always mediated to some extent or another by a cathectic response. Even apathy, after all, is a kind of emotional response, albeit a vacuous one. Now, these responses, these cathectic responses, are not coincidental to the development of our cognitive processing, for they include the desire to know more, and the desire to avoid knowing more, the desire to remember, and the desire to forget. There is, in other words, a kind of appetite which is evoked in our intellectual and perceptual faculties themselves. As Aristotle pointed out, all human beings, by nature, desire to know. Now, this opens up a difficult-to-articulate aspect of our cognitive lives, the aspect of lived experience, an aspect which is shared in common with other animals, though of a different kind, insofar as our experiences are of different kinds, which it has long been questioned whether artificial intelligence can ever possess. And it is a related question, right, whether or not artificial intelligence can or should possess some mechanism which enables cathectic responses, or something simulating cathectic responses. And I think this is a ongoing difficulty, right, of, how can we quantify and therefore translate cathectic experience, cathectic responses, into an artificial mechanism. So, at any rate, much of the philosophical literature which has discussed AI over the past several decades, which has been principally discussed within the tradition of analytic philosophy, and especially analytic philosophy of mind, much of this philosophical literature questions whether artificial intelligence will be like us in terms of its having experience, whether it will or can have a lived experience or qualia or consciousness. And usually this philosophical literature then spirals into debates over what consciousness is or what qualia are, and it does not seem, I think, to progress very far. But beyond these debates about lived experience and cathectic responses, there is another aspect to our intelligence, which the AI-invested community seems not to have grasped. Perhaps because so few people have, namely, that aforementioned grasp of intelligible meaning. Consider. In one sense, there is absolutely no doubt that the search algorithms employed by Google are a form of artificial intelligence. Not human-equivalent artificial intelligence, that artificial general intelligence, but an artificially intelligent application nonetheless. You can ask Google, what is the meaning of life? And you'll receive about 60,200,000 answers, at least at the time of writing this back in March of 2019. Some of which are very pertinently related, and others not so much. Of course, the top answers you get are probably not great ones, and I'm sure that a lot of them will include Douglas Adams references. It is possible, even probable, that giving this query to Google in the future, it will provide not only an aggregate of links to answers, but its own answer. That is, it will investigate what is said in those aggregated links, and find a way to summarize what seems best within them. And Google already does this to a moderate extent in the function of knowledge panels, and with regards to some of the answers that it will bring up at the tops of its results, to simpler and less involved questions, typically. But often what's being drawn upon here is something like Wikipedia or the dictionary, but it may include information from other reputed sources as well. What I mean to demonstrate by this example is that the assumption AI developers have heretofore taken with regard to meaning is that even our apparently abstract process of ideation can be sufficiently replicated by summarizing from a plurality. That we human beings determine meaning not by any insight into the intelligible, but rather by extrapolating a generality from many referential instances. That, in other words, our concepts may provide us meaning which extends beyond any particular context of referential meaning, but only by being meta-contextual. And yet, still, in that meta-contextual, it is bound by referentiality. Or, another way of putting this is that the intelligible meaning is nothing more than a function derived from referential meaning. And I think we can see this thinking or belief about the nature of artificial intelligence exemplified in the other prominent instances beyond Google of what has been touted as AI success, as for instance in the chess-dominating computer of IBM, Deep Blue, or the Jeopardy champion-crushing Watson, or DeepMind and its AlphaGo system, which went undefeated against the top 20 Go players in the world, including by using moves that defied literal millennia of tradition and strategic wisdom, and its derived system of AlphaZero, which learned not only to beat human players of both chess and Go, but also beat the other human-surpassing AIs, as well as the boom seen in recent years of digital assistant technologies such as Siri and Alexa and Google Home, and even Microsoft Cortana, in driving safety systems in cars, and so on. What we see in all these systems is an emerging capacity for referential superiority to that possessed by humans and other animals alike. At the moment, the programs are geared towards specific contexts: searching, driving, playing games. But what has been demonstrated through some systems, and in particular with AlphaZero, was that by marrying certain approaches to AI, the system could learn things for which it was not explicitly programmed. That is, with the right combination of systems in place, it is possible, though far from yet realized, to build an AI that could grasp any and every possible context of referential meaning, and provide solutions to problems within it. To give some idea of what I'm thinking about here, in terms of referential contexts and problems therein, think about the ways in which many animals are superior in navigating their environments to human beings. Think about the kind of memory that you see displayed in animals like hummingbirds or migrating birds of any sort, where they know how and when to leave in order to avoid the worst of weather and find the best environments typically for their continued thriving. Or, I think a lot of hummingbirds. I have a couple hummingbird feeders outside my apartment, and as well as a plant that they seem to enjoy. And they know how long it takes for the flowers to repopulate with nectar, which seems the sort of thing a fair bit beyond our own typical human understanding of environmental contexts. And so we can think about how AI is progressing, and we can recognize that it's far better at those sorts of things, or can be far better at those sorts of things in terms of taking in data and analyzing it and determining, patterns and how patterns unfold, and coming to certain decisions about the right course of action based upon an input goal. And, it's much more capable of dealing with those things, it seems, than human beings are. Just as other animals are much better at dealing with their own environmental problems and coming to solutions for them than we ourselves are. But this idea of this, development of a superior AI, which would be superior to human beings in many ways, would be, succinctly put, the ultimate problem solver. And so I think this does carry a kind of dystopian possibility, which must be said, in that if the robots begin deciding what constitute problems, as any ultimate problem solver must, the robots may then pursue ends which are at odds with what is good for human beings. You can see, the well-known science fiction writer, Isaac Asimov, encountered this struggle in formulating his so-called laws of robotics, which laws pervaded his fictional universe as a way of keeping robots from upending humanity. And most of Asimov's stories, it has to be noted, involve ways that these laws failed to prevent robot-induced tragedies. But I think these dystopian nightmares are not the only potential fallout from an AI which could solve all problems. That is, the real dystopian nightmare may not be from the robots becoming our bitter enemies, but rather from their being too good of servants. And so since I'm already over 33 minutes now, I'm going to wrap it up here and conclude in a final video, which hopefully won't take me another couple of months to get to. But here I just want to sort of recap it very briefly, is that there's a real strong misunderstanding about what's specific and what's unique to human intelligence. And with this misunderstanding, there is a real, struggle in understanding whether or not robots and AI can truly be intelligent. That is, they do seem to have the kind of intelligence common to all animals in terms of problem solving, that they can be programmed with information in order to sort of run certain functions in order to address what's going on in contexts of referential meaning. But it is not at all clear whether or not robots have any capacity, or could be developed in such a way as to have the capacity to deal with intelligible meaning. And I think the confusions that have some people thinking robots can deal with intelligible meaning stem only from a misunderstanding of what intelligible meaning itself really is, and what it truly is for human beings and in our experience. And so that's a little bit of an I guess not a side, but a deeper issue, which is not explicitly addressed by the paper, which I've tried to get at in some other places. So, thank you for listening, as always, and thank you for subscribing. And please, if you find these worth your time, consider donating to my Patreon. There's a lot going on there. I understand, and I understand that everyone has limits on to whom and how and when they can give their money. But if you can spare $2 a month, it means an awful lot to me. So, thank you, and I hope to get to the third video soon.